All right, so welcome back. So in this part, this is part three, we're going to continue talking about our kind of hierarchy of organization. We're going to look specifically at our tissue level of organization. So if you recall from part one, we talked about the study of tissues being called histology, right? So that prefix histo means histology. And we have four broad categories of of tissue. So we have connective tissue, we have nervous tissue, we have muscle tissue, and we have epithelial tissue. All right. So first one here, we have connective, right? So connective is going to provide support for surrounding tissues. It can also allow tissues to come in contact with each other. So if you think of something like a tendon that attaches a muscle to a bone, or you think of something like a ligament attaching a piece of a bone to a piece of another bone. These are all different types of connective tissue. The cartilage in between your joints, this is a type of connective tissue. Your bones themselves are a type of connective tissue. The blood in your blood vessels is actually a type of connective tissue. It's a liquid connective tissue. Okay. And so again, remember all of these tissues, no matter what we're talking about, they're going to be cellular because by definition, a tissue is made up of at least two different types of cells working together for a common function, right? So for our connective tissue, and when we get into lab, uh, you'll better appreciate this, but you'll learn how to identify them based on their characteristics. So you look at a specific histological image of a tissue, and based on that image, you'll be able to look at characteristics and say, okay, that's probably hyaline cartilage because it has this characteristic and this characteristic and this characteristic. All right. So those are connective tissues, right? They're providing support, okay, and integrity. All right. Second we have is epithelial. All right. So epithelial tissues or an epithelium are generally lining the opening of some type of cavity or some type of entryway or open tubes. So if you think of your skin, so when you look down at your hand and you see your skin and you touch it and you feel it, that is an epithelial tissue. Okay. These epithelial tissues are going to be in contact with the external environment. Okay, in some way or another. In some contexts, this is very easy to understand. In other contexts, it's a little bit more difficult when we get into things like uh, in the um, in the digestive tract and maybe parts of the kidney as well. Okay, but we'll talk about that. So epithelial tissues, they can line surfaces. They can have secretory, they can have absorptive functions, they can also have protective functions as well, right? Um, and so if you think of the inside of your mouth, so the inside of your cheek, so if you run your tongue on the inside of your cheek, what your tongue is in contact with is an epithelial tissue on the inside of your mouth, right? If you think about the inside of your mouth, it's in contact with the external environment, right? You open up your mouth, the air and the external environment is in contact with that. Okay. Now, our epithelial tissues are also polar. Okay, they're polarized, meaning they have a polarity. They have um, a directionality to them. There is a top to an epithelial tissue, and there is a bottom to an epithelial tissue. The top we're going to call the apical side. The bottom we're going to call the basal side. Okay. Um, Next we have is our muscle tissue. Okay, and we have three different types of muscle tissue that can be differentiated based on their um, general characteristics, based on the um, way in which they contract, whether or not it's voluntary or involuntary, and then whether or not they're what's called striated or non-striated. Okay, and we'll look at these, and again, we'll have a whole lecture specifically on muscle, and we'll look at skeletal and maybe a little bit of smooth, and then in AP2, when you get to the cardiovascular system, you'll talk about the cardiac muscle tissue. Okay. Now, the term voluntary just means that you have conscious control over moving that muscle. If it is involuntary, you do not, right? So it's under the autonomic nervous system that we'll talk about later in this course. And then striated versus non-striated. Striations for now, just for now, um, are um, these lines that you see here running across the muscle tissue. So this is an example of skeletal muscle tissue. These lines represent the striations, okay? And we'll talk more specifically about striations whenever we do our muscle lecture, okay? And then lastly, our last type of tissue is nervous tissue, okay? And again, Because this is a tissue, it's going to have at least two different types of cells, and these cells are going to be neurons, and they're going to be glial or neuroglial cells. Okay, neurons are the cells that actually generate and propagate our electrical impulses that we'll call action potentials. We'll look at this when we do our excitable cells lecture later in the semester. And then glial cells or neuroglia are going to be kind of supporting cells that can nourish and help with the functionality of our neurons. Okay, so if we look here, we're not going to spend a ton of time on this because we're going to have a totally separate lecture on epithelial tissues excuse me, on histology in general, including epithelial tissues. But for now, when you look at an epithelial tissue, here you see there are rows of cells or multiple cells that are lining some surface. When you look at an epithelial tissue, and this is particularly important when you look at it in lab, when you look at a histological image, anytime when you see white above it, so you see white up here, white on tops of these cells, that is the external environment. Okay, so that tells you that this part up here, this is the apical part. This part down here is the basal part. Okay, now epithelial tissues can be one layer, they can be two layers, they can be lots of layers. They can have different extensions on their surface. So if you look here on this one down here, this looks like it has microvilli, and we'll talk about what microvilli are in chapter 3. Okay, but for now, just know that they're lining the opening of tubes and passageways. They're going to be in contact with the external environment, and they can have protective, absorptive, and secretory functions. Okay. All right, next one is muscle tissue. So we said we have skeletal, smooth, cardiac. Skeletal is our only voluntary muscle, and it's associated with our skeleton. Smooth we have in our stomach, lining our blood vessels, and then cardiac we obviously have as part of our heart. And skeletal is our only voluntary, as we said, and smooth and cardiac are going to be involuntary, meaning we do not have conscious control over their contraction. Okay, nervous is our next one. So we said nervous has neurons or nerve cells and glial cells, and we'll talk about different types of neurons. We'll talk about different types of glial cells whenever we get to those in the course later in the semester. And then our connective, right? So tendons, ligaments, bones, fat, blood, cartilage, these are all different types of connective tissues that help bind and support other surrounding tissues. Okay. All right. So these next 7, 8 slides or so are just going to give you a brief overview of the different organ systems that will be covered in both AMP1 and AMP2. And now we'll cover only some of these in AMP1, and then what we do not cover in AMP1, you'll cover in AMP2. All right. So our integumentary system, this is our skin and all of its accessory structures. So hair, nails, sweat glands, oil glands, things like that. Our skin, as you'll learn in AMP2, is what's called our innate first line of defense, right? So in order for pathogens to get into our body generally, they would have to enter through the skin. That's at least one portal of entry, right? And so if you have intact, healthy, protective skin, that's going to be a very important component of your immune system. If you have a cut, if you have some type of opening or incision, you've now put yourself at an increased risk for some type of infection, right? We know that we can also regulate our body temperature through the use of our skin, through sweat glands, through the vasodilation of blood vessels for thermoregulation. And we'll talk about these whenever we do our skin lecture, all right? We have our skeletal system that we'll talk about in AMP1. Skeletal system is very basically all of our skeleton, the associated bones and the joints that come together. It is involved with our protection and support. We can also produce our blood cells here in our skeletal system through a process known as hemopoiesis, sometimes called hematopoiesis. Okay, poiesis means the production of or the stimulation of, and then hemo. Anytime you see the term heme or hemo, this is referring to blood. Okay. And we'll talk about this more specifically in our skeletal system lecture. And then we can also store phosphate. We can also store calcium in our bones as well, right? Now, calcium has a number of different functions in the body, one of which is the hardness to our bones so that they're not extremely brittle. But calcium also plays a role in our blood. It plays a role in our nervous system functionality. It also plays a role in our skeletal muscle contraction as well. Okay. All right. We also have our muscular system, which is in close association with our skeletal system, right? So this is our skeletal muscles, not smooth muscle and not cardiac muscle. So only skeletal muscle. Is involved largely with movement, right? The muscles contract. In order to produce the movement, they have to be in some way attached to the bone or to the skeletal system, and this is accomplished via a tendon. And they can also be involved in heat production through the shivering action, right? We have our nervous system, and this is our last system that we'll talk about in A&P 1, and then all of the rest you'll talk about in A&P 2. So our nervous system in general, brain, spinal cord, and then nerves, so whether those are peripheral nerves or those are cranial nerves coming out from the brain or the spinal cord, we're going to have our nervous system respond to stimuli, generate and coordinate some type of response. So like if you touch the hot stovetop, you're immediately going to retract your hand in a autonomic reflex, right? You don't really have to think about it. And then when we do our nervous system, we'll talk about sensory nervous system, motor nervous system, autonomic nervous system, and all of the functions that come with each of those. Okay. So now for AMP2 systems, you're going to talk about the endocrine system, which is your first lecture in AMP2. That involves the use of hormones. Now, the endocrine system and the nervous system are very closely related in the sense that they both exert an effect over our body tissues and different functions, but they do so in a little bit different way. Nervous system is very fast and very short-lived. Endocrine system is a little bit slower, and usually it's a little bit more long-lived. Okay, but different glands like the hypothalamus, pituitary gland, thyroid, your gonads, pancreas, adrenal gland, these are all part of your endocrine system. And again, the main product that they secrete is they secrete hormones. Okay. Next one is your cardiovascular system, right? So this can be divided into two, the cardio part and the vascular part, right? So cardio is referring to the heart, vascular is referring to the blood vessels, right? So arteries and veins and capillaries, okay? So the heart continues to pump and contract. It ejects blood, and you'll talk about this in AMP2, and it ejects that blood into the arteries, which by definition take blood away from the body. They go to the tissues, and then they return to the heart via veins, which by definition bring blood back to the heart, right? All the while they're transporting different nutrients, waste products like carbon dioxide, gases. They're taking things to the kidney to be filtered out, right? So this is our transportation system in the body, right? We have our lymphatic system, which is very closely associated with our immune system. It's going to involve the spleen, thymus, lymph nodes, right? So when you go to the doctor and they feel your neck and they're feeling those large kind of bean-shaped structures, those are your lymph nodes in your body. You have different ones around your pectoral region, some in your axillary region, your cervical region. And in our lymphatic system, we're going to be transporting something called lymph or lymphatic fluid, okay, which is essentially it's essentially like the plasma of the blood, which is kind of more of just the liquid part of the blood, okay? But there are a good number of immune cells that are concentrated in the lymph nodes that if they detect a foreign pathogen or some type of foreign cell, they can begin to initiate an immune response against that, okay? We have our respiratory system, right? So this is going to be involving our mouth, our pharynx, our larynx, trachea, bronchi, bronchioles, and our lungs, right? And the main job of this is to bring air in, bring in oxygen, exchange it with carbon dioxide. We blow carbon dioxide out of the body, and we take that oxygen to our tissues via the cardiovascular system that we just mentioned, right? Urinary system, this is going to be things like kidney, ureter, bladders, and urethra. We filter our blood, right? So our urine comes from our blood, right? Hopefully everyone knows that. And the kidneys can be involved in regulating the composition of the blood, composition of the urine, electrolyte balance. So our different electrolytes, sodium, potassium, calcium, their concentrations in the body, and they can also just get rid of waste in general. Okay, and you'll talk about this in AP2. We then have our digestive system, right? So starting again in our mouth, like the respiratory system. But instead of going to the trachea, we're going to go just posterior to that and go down the esophagus. We'll then go to the stomach. We'll go to the small and large intestine. Then you have your accessory structures, so things like the liver, pancreas, gallbladder, things like this. And the whole job of the digestive system is to intake food right through the mouth, esophagus, bring it into the stomach, break it down into um, small components, and then begin to um, absorb the necessary nutrients and water and electrolytes from that, and then excrete the waste products. Okay. And then lastly, we have our reproductive systems, right? So reproductive systems are going to be the primary system that's going to be different between males and females. Most of the other systems that we've talked about are going to be more or less the same in terms of the structures and the location. For our reproductive systems, there are going to be some differences, right? So for females, you have things like the ovaries, the uterus, and the vagina. In males, you have structures that are different. They're in a relatively similar location, but you're going to have things like the testes. You're going to have something called the vas or the ductus deferens, and I'll tell you a little bit more about that in just a second. And then you have the penis as well, right? The overarching goal of the reproductive system is the production of offspring, right? If you think of it from a kind of a biological, or you think of it from like an evolutionary standpoint, the whole goal of the reproductive system is to produce more offspring to pass on your genes and get it into the next generation. We said earlier for a characteristic of life that this is necessary for the survival of the species as a whole and not for the individuals. Okay. Now I'll tell you something more about this ductus deferens. It has two names, okay, and you'll see it as having these two names, and you'll talk about it in AP2, vas and ductus. The term vas, V-A-S, refers to a vessel, okay? Early anatomists, when they found this structure, they thought it was a vessel. They thought it was a blood vessel, an artery, or a vein. Well, it's not, right? We know now that it's not. It's more of a duct. So a more appropriate name for it is the ductus deferens, whereas the vas deferens is a little bit kind of a misnomer. However, you still hear it called vas deferens, and this term is still in use in the form of the word vasectomy, right? So the vasectomy is the cutting and the severing of the vas deferens or the ductus deferens to prevent sperm from entering the urethra during intercourse, as to prevent the formation of a pregnancy, right? So you still see the term vas, you'll see the term ductus. If you want to be more anatomically accurate, use the term ductus deferens instead of vas deferens. All right. Okay, we will stop here, and then we'll pick up talking about anatomical position and different body regions in the next lecture.